Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're jumping into a really fascinating period, looking at some sources that take us straight back to mid-century America. We're talking post-World War II. You know, the time you often hear about is peak affluence, the American dream in full swing. But, well, what our sources really bring out is this massive contradiction hiding right there. I mean, you've got unprecedented economic growth, the whole rising tide thing, and yet millions of Americans were completely left behind, still locked in this persistent, really crushing poverty. And it wasn't random. It was systemic. We're talking about African Americans, Latinos, Native Americans, folks in rural areas, largely cut off from that boom, because of discrimination, lack of access, these deep structural problems. So our mission for this deep dive is to unpack the big political response to that. We're going to explore what really was the high watermark of mid-century American liberalism, Lyndon Johnson's Great Society. And just as importantly, we'll look at this huge simultaneous shift in U.S. immigration policy that happened right around the same time in 1965. It's really a story of federal ambition.
Right. And if you're trying to pinpoint maybe the spark, the thing that really got the ball rolling politically, you absolutely have to look at Michael Harrington's book, The Other America. Came out in '62. Before Harrington, I think a lot of people just kind of dismissed poverty, thought it was isolated, maybe individual failings, Harrington just blew that idea up. He showed people, look, there are these huge pockets of real hardship hidden away from the comfortable suburbs. He laid out how systemic it was, how invisible to the middle class. And that book, it wasn't just a bestseller. It directly landed on President Johnson's desk and really spurred the whole war on poverty agenda.
Okay, so that's the spark. But the sheer scale of the response, that required a certain political climate, right?
Yeah.
A belief system that could actually support such massive federal action?
Oh, absolutely. The mid-'60s it was the peak for a very specific mindset. Globally, the U.S. was all about anti-communism, standing up for freedom, democracy. But domestically, that translated into this incredible, almost unwavering faith in what the federal government could achieve. The thinking was kind of like, hey, if we can pour resources into fighting communism overseas, surely we can use federal power and know how to fix these big social problems right here at home. And that confidence, plus, crucially, a huge Democratic majority in Congress, let Johnson really go big.
Okay, let's unpack that. Going big. Johnson used that political momentum and fast.
Right.
So the Great Society, its main goals were what? Wiping out poverty, tackling racial discrimination, just generally boosting well-being.
Exactly. Those were the lofty goals. And the tools they used were, frankly, revolutionary for the time, especially around basic rights and services. You can kind of break the domestic stuff into two main pillars. The first one really focused on economic opportunity and healthcare. This was fundamental because it went after the structural things holding people back. So on health, you get Medicare. That's the federal health insurance, specifically for Americans 65 and older. Huge. And right alongside it, Medicaid. Federally funded health coverage for low-income folks, individuals, and families. I mean, think about it. The government suddenly took on primary responsibility for health security for the elderly and the poor. That's a massive expansion of the federal role.
Right, and the economic opportunity part, those programs were ambitious too, weren't they? It wasn't just about aid, it was about building pathways out of poverty.
Precisely. That was the idea. And the centerpiece there was the Office of Economic Opportunity, the OEO. It did things like vocational training, literacy programs. But what's really fascinating and kind of radical was its philosophy. The OEO pushed for maximum feasible participation, meaning they actually tried to get the poor involved in running the programs themselves. This wasn't just top-down. It aimed to give real administrative, even political power to marginalized communities, which, as you can imagine, was pretty controversial.
Yeah, I bet. I remember reading the pushback was intense because it directly challenged, local mayors and power brokers.
It absolutely did. But alongside the OEO, you also had really essential things like the Food Stamp Act, getting nutritional aid out there, and Job Corps, focusing on job training and education, specifically for disadvantaged youth. So it was all meant to work together, health, skills, support, to create a real ladder up.
Okay, so that's pillar one. Pillar two, you said, was education and civil rights, addressing that deep link between racism and economic inequality. For education, the big one was Head Start, right? Which wasn't just preschool.
No, not at all. Head Start was designed to be holistic. Early childhood education, yes, but also nutrition, health services. The idea was to try and level the playing field for low-income kids before they even hit kindergarten, to close those early gaps.
And then, of course, the absolute bedrock laws. You can't talk about the Great Society without the Civil Rights Act of '64.
Right. Ending legal segregation. Monumental.
And the Voting Rights Act of '65, which used federal power to really secure voting rights for African Americans. Those two just fundamentally rewrote the rules.
They did. And, later on you see that link between race and economics made even more explicit. Think about Martin Luther King Jr.'s Poor People's Campaign in 1968. He was trying to bring together all these different groups, Black, Latino, Native American, poor whites, to demand economic justice, really connecting the civil rights fight directly to economic fairness. The vision was truly comprehensive reform.
So, okay, you have this incredibly ambitious plan, the political will, these landmark laws. Why didn't it work? I mean, why didn't the war on poverty actually eliminate poverty, which was the stated aim?
Yeah, that's the tragic part, really. I mean, first off, poverty cycles were incredibly deep-rooted, right? These programs needed time and consistent effort. But the huge external factor, the thing that looms over everything, was Vietnam. The sources are pretty clear on this. The sheer cost of the Vietnam War just sucked funding away. These Great Society programs were designed to ramp up to scale significantly. But the money got diverted almost immediately. They were essentially underfunded from the start, or at least very quickly became underfunded relative to the scale of the problem and the original vision. That really hampered their long-term impact.
Okay, this is where it gets even more layered. While Congress is passing all these laws, the Supreme Court is also incredibly active, right? The Warren Court, under Chief Justice Earl Warren from 53 to 69, it seems like the court was almost judicially reinforcing the same liberal principles, writing them into the Constitution itself. How did the courts fit in with what Johnson was doing legislatively?
That's a crucial connection. The Warren Court essentially provided the constitutional scaffolding, the legal legitimacy for this expanding federal role in protecting rights and promoting social justice. Without the court's rulings, a lot of the Great Society's goals might have faced much tougher legal challenges or lacked real enforcement power. You just have to look at some key cases. Like Gideon v. Wainwright in 1963, that guaranteed a lawyer for defendants in state courts who couldn't afford one. Think about that. It's about ensuring due process isn't just for the wealthy. It perfectly mirrors that OEO idea of equal opportunity, but in the legal system.
And it wasn't just about criminal justice, right? The rulings on personal freedoms were pretty earth-shattering, too.
Oh, absolutely. You get Griswold v. Connecticut in 65. That struck down state laws banning contraception. And in doing so, it established this constitutional right to privacy. That right to privacy became the foundation for so many later rulings about personal autonomy, things that are still debated fiercely today.
And there were others, too, defining the line between church and state.
Right, like Engel v. Vitale in 62, which banned mandatory prayer in public schools, reinforcing that separation. And then maybe one of the most politically charged ones, Baker v. Carr, also in 62.
Wait, Baker v. Carr, that's the one person, one vote case, forcing states to redraw legislative districts based on population. Politically, how big a deal was forcing states to do that?
It was enormous, absolutely huge. Before Baker, you had states where maybe rural districts with tiny populations had way more power in the state legislature than big, growing cities. Some districts hadn't been redrawn in decades. The court basically said, nope, representation has to be based on population. It forced this massive shift in political power towards urban and suburban areas. It was a fundamental democratic restructuring mandated by the court. So yeah, these court decisions weren't just happening alongside the Great Society. They were weaving its core ideas, equity, fairness, participation, directly into the fabric of constitutional law.
Okay, let's pivot now. Because happening at almost the exact same time as all this domestic upheaval, there's another revolution going on, one that maybe gets less attention but completely changed the face of America. The Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965. This wasn't just tweaking the rules, it was a fundamental break from the past. It completely got rid of the old national origins quotas.
Yeah, quotas that had been law for like 40 years.
Right. And those quotas were explicitly racist, weren't they? Designed to keep America mostly Northern and Western European and severely limit immigrants from Asia, Africa, Southern Europe.
Exactly. It was blatant discrimination written into law. So the 1965 Act wipes that slate clean. It dismantles those quotas entirely. And that's the synthesis, right? Just as the Great Society is trying to break down internal barriers for Americans already here, the 65 Immigration Act is breaking down these external barriers for people who want to come here.
So what did it replace the quotas with?
It set up a new system. Two main priorities. Family reunification, letting immigrants bring over relatives, and professional skills, attracting people with needed job skills. And the impact. It was immediate and just. Profound. Immigration patterns shifted dramatically. Instead of mostly Europeans, you start seeing huge increases in immigration from Asia, from Latin America, from the Caribbean. This act fundamentally changed who was coming to America, moving the country away from that primarily European demographic base it had maintained for centuries.
And like everything else in this era, there's a Cold War angle here too, right? This wasn't purely about idealism.
Definitely not purely. Foreign policy was always intertwined. Look at the Cuban Adjustment Act in 1966. It basically gave Cubans fleeing Castro's regime a fast track to permanent residency after just 1 year in the U.S. And you see the human drama in things like Operation Pedro Pan earlier, between 60 and 62. Over 14,000 Cuban kids, unaccompanied, brought to the U.S. specifically to get them away from the communist regime.
Wow, 14,000. And that humanitarian aspect, tied to conflict, continued.
It did. Later, you get the Indochina Migration and Refugee Act after the Vietnam War, helping resettle refugees from Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos. Offering refuge was part of America's image, contrasting itself with the closed societies of the Soviet bloc.
It also involved things like international adoption, didn't it?
Yeah, that saw a big increase, too, especially adoptions from countries caught up in conflict or its aftermath, like Korea and Vietnam. So these policies weren't just abstract numbers. They were literally changing the makeup of American families and communities.
And our sources mention specific stories, like Jose Ruvalcaba. His story kind of embodies what these policy changes meant on a personal level, doesn't it?
It really does. He represents those families who suddenly could come, people who, before 1965, would have been shut out by the quotas. Now the door was open. They could access education here, find economic opportunities that just weren't available before. The 65 Act didn't just change statistics, it unlocked entirely new futures for millions, people previously deemed, well, undesirable by the old system.
It's really stunning when you step back and see it all happening at once. The mid-60s, Congress is launching Medicare, the Supreme Court is defining a right to privacy, and immigration law is being completely overturned. The sheer scope.
It's incredible, isn't it? The amount of simultaneous government action across so many domains. Poverty, civil rights, constitutional law, immigration, refugee policy, all happening together.
So taking it all in, what's the big takeaway here? The Great Society of the 65 Immigration Act. What did they represent in the grand scheme of things?
Well, I think you'd have to say they represented the absolute peak, the high watermark of this particular American belief. The belief that concentrated, ambitious federal action could fundamentally reshape society for the better.
Using the full power of the central government to tackle inequality, expand opportunity, both for people already here and for those who wanted to come. It was just this period of intense, maybe even unique, optimism about government's power to solve huge problems.
That optimism is key. And it leads to a really provocative question for today, I think. If you accept the premise that the goals and the structure of the Great Society were largely sound, that they were aimed at real systemic issues, but that the critical funding, the resources needed to actually make it work on the intended scale, got siphoned off almost immediately by the Vietnam War, then how did that diversion of resources shape everything that came after? Did it fundamentally lower our expectations for what federal social programs could achieve? Did the war on poverty fail because it was badly designed, or because it was essentially starved before it ever got a real chance? That's something worth thinking about, especially when you hear debates today about government spending, social safety nets, and the scope of federal power.